The bell above the door gave a tired little ring as he stepped inside. A Tuesday afternoon in the middle of nowhere, the kind of day when the highway shimmered with heat, though the calendar insisted it was fall. The place smelled of fried onions, stale coffee, and the faint sweetness of pie that had been sitting too long under a glass cover. A jukebox hummed low in the corner, but no one had fed it coins in hours. He was 79, his back slightly bent, from years he didn't speak about, hands trembling not because of fear, but because the body had its own memory of time. His jacket was clean but worn, the stitching faded, the sort of garment that had seen more weather than fashion. He moved slowly toward the counter, one cautious step at a time, the rubber soles of his shoes whispering against the linoleum. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with a tired smile, leaned across the counter with her notepad ready. "Just coffee," he murmured, his voice quiet but steady, though the effort to speak showed in the tightening of his throat. Two young men sat in a booth not far away. They wore matching athletic jackets, glossy nylon shining under the fluorescent lights, their sneakers propped casually on the edge of the seat. They'd been laughing already, but when they caught sight of the old man, their voices sharpened, found a target. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them called, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "You still remember how to use a spoon, or do they feed you at home?" The second one barked a laugh that bounced too harshly off the metal napkin holders. Heads turned. Some patrons smiled politely, as though the remark was harmless. Others dropped their eyes into their plates, pretending not to hear. The veteran lowered his gaze to the counter, his fingers curling lightly around the chipped porcelain mug the waitress had set in front of him. His knuckles were thin, the veins raised like old rivers under pale skin. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have words, but because he knew that in this place, in this moment, words would fall like pebbles into a storm drain, swallowed without sound. The silence he left behind was heavier than anything he could have spoken. The first boy smirked, nudging his friend. "Look at him. Doesn't even know what year it is. Probably thinks Eisenhower's still president." Their laughter carried, cutting through the clink of cutlery. Around them, the diner became a strange theater. A man in a baseball cap shook his head slightly, not in disapproval, but in that small gesture people use when they want to detach themselves from trouble. A young couple at the corner booth glanced quickly, then bent over their phones, thumbs moving faster, as if the glow of the screen could shield them. And through it all, the veteran sat motionless, staring into the black surface of his coffee. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, as though holding back something heavier than the insult itself. At another table, several rows back, a man who hadn't spoken since he arrived shifted ever so slightly. He had been eating scrambled eggs, quietly, almost deliberately invisible. His hair was shorter than most, his posture straight, though relaxed, a presence that didn't need to announce itself. Chuck Norris. His expression gave away nothing, just the calm attentiveness of someone who noticed more than most people thought worth noticing. But his eyes followed the exchange. They were steady, patient, almost detached, yet alive with a focus that contradicted the stillness of his body. The laughter from the booth returned, harsher this time, emboldened by the lack of pushback. One of the boys slapped the table with his palm. The sound startled a woman at the counter, making her fork scrape against her plate. The veteran blinked, his fingers tightening fractionally on the handle of his cup. There was no dramatic outburst from him, no words of defense, just the sound of his quiet breathing, the rise and fall of his chest under that faded jacket. His silence became something uncanny, like a space the entire room was aware of, but no one dared to enter. It wasn't just that he didn't fight back. It was that his stillness forced everyone else to confront their own unease. The people around him weren't laughing anymore. They were waiting. Waiting to see if he would break, or if someone else would. The fluorescent lights flickered once, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filling the gap between noises. Somewhere outside, a semi roared past on the highway, shaking the window panes. Then the sound was gone, leaving the diner even more trapped in its small bubble of tension. The first boy leaned back in the booth, smirking with the satisfaction of someone who thought he'd won. The veteran finally lifted the mug to his lips, his hand trembling slightly, but he managed to sip without spilling. His eyes, though, remained cast downward. And in the far booth, Chuck Norris set his fork down gently, wiped his hands on a napkin, and leaned back, eyes never leaving the scene unfolding at the counter. Nothing happened, and yet something had begun. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The taller of the two boys scraped his chair back, loud enough to snag the room's attention. He stood with a bounce in his step, then hunched forward, shoulders shaking, his knees bent in a clumsy caricature of age. Each shuffle across the aisle dragged too long, a parody of fragile footsteps. His arms dangled as if unstrung, head bobbing loosely on his neck. The act was clumsy, but the cruelty in it gave it weight. Laughter cracked across the booths. Not all at once. Uneven bursts, like fireworks set off at the wrong time. A young couple in the corner stifled their giggles behind a phone screen. A trucker in a faded cap gave a half smile before burying himself in his burger. One or two customers frowned, but none spoke. The performance had pulled them into its orbit, and silence was easier than resistance. At the counter, the old man's hands rested near the mug the waitress had just placed down. His fingers trembled on their own rhythm, knuckles thin as sticks. He tried to ignore the show, tried to make his body still. But the boy's steps exaggerated the shaking, throwing it back at him like a reflection in warped glass. "Careful now," the kid croaked in a brittle falsetto, panting between words. "Don't want to fall and break a hip." He reached for a chair, leaned dramatically against it, then exhaled with a groan so loud it startled a woman stirring her tea. His friend howled, slapping the table for emphasis, the sharp clap ricocheting against chrome napkin dispensers. The veteran's jaw worked once before he spoke. His voice was calm but uneven, pulled out of him like rope from a well. "I've seen more than you can imagine." It wasn't boastful. It wasn't a challenge. Just the statement of a man who carried his own history like weight in his pockets. The boy's friend mimicked the line in a high-pitched squeal. "I've seen more than you can imagine," he repeated, batting his eyelashes like a bad stage actor. Phones tilted up. One camera light blinked red, its reflection in the window multiplying the humiliation. The performance was no longer private mockery. It had turned into a show for an audience both here and later, online. That shift thickened the air. The diner became a stage set unwillingly, the old man a character forced into a part he hadn't chosen. Conversations slowed. Forks hovered mid-air. The waitress scrubbed the counter with a rag that had nothing left to clean, her hand moving in nervous circles. The boy leaned closer. Phone out now. "Come on, old-timer. Give us a smile. Tell us a story. Dinosaurs, right? You remember them?" His breath smelled faintly of gum and cheap soda. The lens reflected the veteran's cheek and part of his thinning hair. The veteran stared into his coffee. He didn't flinch. The spoon rattled against porcelain once, then stilled. "A story," he muttered, as if testing the word. His voice carried just enough for those nearest to hear. "I have plenty." For a fraction of a second, silence held. a stillness heavy enough to draw the eyes of strangers who didn't want to be caught looking. Even the boy faltered, one hand lowering an inch. But his friend broke it again, leaning half out of the booth. "Make it short, Pops. Battery's almost dead." He laughed, the sound sharp, meant to keep the momentum alive. The veteran's shoulders lifted once with a long inhale. His lips pressed together, whitening at the edges. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked. Not at the boys' faces, but at the logo stitched onto their jackets. Bright thread sewn onto fabric that had never touched mud or blood or fear. His eyes narrowed, the pupils pulling something unseen into the present. The crowd shifted uneasily. A man near the window whispered, "Don't," though no one could tell if he meant the boys, the old man, or himself. The performer sensed the attention wavering. He doubled down. He bent lower, dragging his feet, exaggerating each wheeze until the sound grated. He pawed at the old man's sleeve. "Easy there. Don't spill. We don't need a cleanup fee." A few people laughed weakly, out of obligation more than joy. Others stared down at plates, stabbing at food without eating. The scene was losing its humor, but no one stopped it. From the back booth, a cup shifted. Porcelain slid against saucer with the softest scrape. Almost no one noticed, but those who did straightened instinctively. Chuck Norris had set his coffee down. The movement was ordinary but carried a strange weight. He didn't glare. He didn't posture. He simply cleared his hands. The waitress caught it. For the briefest moment her eyes flicked to him, as if checking the time on a clock she hadn't realized was there. Then she looked away. The boy with the phone grinned wider, oblivious. "Tell you what. If you can lift that cup without spilling, I'll pay your bill. Generous, right?" He pointed the camera down at the trembling hands, angling for a shot. The veteran didn't move. His breath was steady. Somewhere, oil hissed on the grill in back, filling the pause. Outside, a horn gave a single irritated blast, then faded. The second boy stepped out of the booth, playing violin on his arm, bowing with fake solemnity. A couple of weak chuckles answered, but the air had changed. Some customers were no longer laughing. They were waiting. Chuck's eyes tracked from the veteran's fingers to the boy's shoes, then to the door, and back again. Calm, assessing, like a carpenter reading the grain of wood before cutting. His hands rested loose on the table, but the air around him felt clearer, as though dust itself had stepped aside. Still, he didn't move. The performer took the pause as permission. He leaned close, phone inches from the old man's face. "Smile," he whispered, voice too soft for the crowd but loud enough for the microphone. The veteran didn't smile. His gaze slid past the lens, past the boy, and locked on something behind him. The boy, sensing a shift but not understanding it, grinned into his reflection in the pie case glass. His friend chuckled nervously. A chair leg scraped the floor at the far end of the diner. Chuck was rising. The cup sat exactly where he'd placed it, a marker, a quiet declaration. The nearest customers stopped chewing. The teenagers lowered their phones just slightly. Breath caught in more than one throat. The performer finally turned his head, drawn by the silence he hadn't created, and for the first time, he realized the room was no longer laughing with him. The taller boy decided to raise the stakes. Without warning, his hand darted forward, fingers snapping the brim of the old man's cap. One swift tug, and it was gone. "Hey," he said, planting it crookedly on his own head. "Looks better on me." A ripple passed through the diner, the kind that isn't laughter but nervous release. The cap wasn't new. Sun faded, sweat-stained, edges frayed to thread. But it carried a weight no one in that booth understood. The veteran's hand lifted, palm open, asking for it back. He didn't beg. He just reached. A gesture plain and direct, like asking for air. The boy rocked backward, keeping the cap out of reach. "Whoa there! Don't trip. Pretty sure you don't need this anymore." He turned to his friend's phone, making sure the shot caught the trophy. The veteran's fingers grazed nothing. He steadied himself against the counter, his other hand pressed flat. The tremor in his arm seemed louder now, amplified by the eyes on him. A few weak laughs broke out, more uncomfortable than amused. The waitress stiffened. Her rag hung still at her side. She spoke low, but it traveled farther than she meant. "Give it back." The boy ignored her, tugging the cap lower. He raised 2 fingers in a sloppy parody of a salute. His friend cackled. The red light on the camera blinked steadily. The veteran dropped his hand, jaw clamped. His silence was heavier than the boy's noise. It carried through the room, settling like dust in a place no one wanted to breathe. And then something shifted. Not sound, not movement. Attention. The back booth stirred. Chuck Norris rose. He didn't scrape his chair. He didn't puff his chest. He simply stood, folding his napkin onto the table, and began walking forward. His steps were unhurried but inevitable, the kind of stride that said the decision had already been made. The boy wearing the cap caught the motion in the window's reflection. He smirked at first, thinking the room had given him an even bigger stage. Then he turned, and the smirk faltered. "Oh," his friend said loudly, forcing a laugh. "Old man's got backup. His angel of mercy." But no one else laughed. Chuck stopped just short of the aisle. His expression was calm, eyes steady, hands loose at his sides. He looked at the cap, then at the old man's empty hand on the counter. "Give it back," he said. No volume, no threat, just a line in the air. The boy tried to grin wider, forcing bravado back into his voice. "It's a joke, man. Relax." He turned to the old veteran, mocking. "He can ask for it himself, right?" The old man didn't answer. His shoulders barely moved with his breath. He wasn't part of the show anymore. Chuck stepped closer, narrowing the space. The geometry of the diner shifted. The veteran, the boy, the cap, and him. The rest of the room leaned without meaning to. "You're wearing something that isn't yours," Chuck said evenly. The boy glanced at his friend, at the camera, at the audience he thought he still owned. "We're just having fun," his voice cracked in the middle. "You don't define the fun," Chuck replied. His tone didn't rise, but the words landed sharp, like something measured and cut. The veteran's eyes lifted finally. They weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They were tired, lined with memories that lived far outside this diner. He looked at the cap and nothing else. "Son," he murmured, not to the boys, but to someone only he could see. The word held no accusation, just loss. The boy shifted, grip tightening on the brim. Sweat dotted his forehead. He tried one last smirk. "What if I don't?" Chuck tilted his head slightly, like he was listening for a rhythm. "Last time," he said, no louder than before, no softer. The boy's breath caught. He looked down at the cap, then back at the veteran's hand. The room had gone silent, every eye waiting. Even the waitress had edged closer, her rag forgotten, her stance ready to move if the old man swayed. The boy raised the cap halfway, unsure. His bravado drained, leaving only hesitation. The friend whispered, "Dude, maybe just—" But the words dissolved before they left his lips. Chuck extended his hand. Not fast, not threatening, just steady. "Sir," he said, glancing at the veteran, and for the first time there was warmth in his voice. "May I?" The old man gave the smallest nod, and as Chuck's hand reached forward, the diner door chimed, a brittle bell above the frame ringing into the silence. Someone new had just walked in. The bell above the door was still ringing when the taller boy made his move. The cap, briefly forgotten in his hand, dangled as he stepped forward and angled his shoulder toward the veteran. It wasn't a punch, not even a shove, just a cheap little nudge, the kind of contact meant to humiliate without looking like violence, a demonstration of strength where none was needed. But he never reached his target. A hand intercepted the motion. Chuck's hand, calm, precise, fingers closing around the boy's wrist in a grip that didn't tighten so much as anchor. One moment, the boy was in motion. The next, he was fixed in place, as if the air itself had hardened. The diner fell silent. Even the laughter, still hanging in the air from before, collapsed into nothing. The only sound left was the soft hiss of the coffee machine in the kitchen, its steady rhythm loud in the sudden stillness. The boy blinked, caught off guard. He twisted his arm instinctively, expecting resistance he could break through. Instead, Chuck rotated with him, the smallest adjustment, and suddenly the boy's palm was turned upward, in a position that robbed him of all leverage. His body sent him a warning he hadn't felt before. Stop, now. The boy's friend tried to cover the pause with noise. What's the plan, old man? This isn't one of your movies. His voice cracked halfway, too sharp, a little desperate. That was the line that changed everything. Whispers rippled through the room. People had been watching, recording, half convinced this was just another ugly scene in a roadside diner. But now they leaned closer, some murmuring names under their breath. A teenager near the window mouthed it without sound. An older man at the counter muttered, "No way," and stared harder. Recognition spread like a current. Some weren't sure, others were. Chuck said nothing at first. His focus was on the boy's wrist, not his own reputation. When he did speak, it was quiet, flat. Not a movie. Just 3 words, spoken with the finality of a carpenter testing a beam and finding it solid. The boy swallowed. His skin was flushed, his wrist tingling with the strange pressure of a hold that wasn't violent but impossible to shake. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was thin, hollow. "All right, man. Let me go." Chuck eased the pressure, but he didn't release. The boy felt the difference. The choice wasn't his. The power to end the hold belonged entirely to someone else. The cameras still pointed at him, but the confidence that had fueled his performance drained under that realization. The veteran sat rigid on his stool, watching. He didn't speak. His hand had drawn back from the counter, fingers flexing slowly, the faintest relief in his posture. He looked not at the boys, not at Chuck, but at the space between them, as though weighing something old against the present moment. "Yo," the friend said, louder now, trying to reclaim the crowd. "That's assault. He can't touch you. Lawsuit, man. Big money." But his voice didn't find traction. No one repeated it. Chuck lifted his eyes, calm and steady. "I'm stopping you from making a mistake." His tone was almost clinical. No anger, no theatrics. Just fact. A murmur of agreement passed through the booths. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Some nodded slightly. Some whispered to their companions. The energy in the diner had shifted completely. No longer a spectacle for phones, but a moment everyone knew would end differently than it had begun. The boy pulled again, sharp and small, trying to prove he still had control. Chuck's hand shifted barely half an inch, redirecting the force. The boy's sneakers squealed against the tile. The move wasn't rough, but it carried humiliation. He realized he'd never been in control at all. "Enough," the veteran said suddenly. One word, rasped but steady. He didn't raise his eyes when he spoke. The sound was more powerful than shouting could have been. Chuck glanced at him briefly, then back at the boy. "You heard him." For a second, it seemed like the boy might relent. His breathing was fast, shallow, chest rising and falling too quickly. Then his pride flared again. His friend, desperate for attention, barked a laugh. "Look, he's scared. Grandpa's bodyguard's scared." The laugh didn't land. The room answered with silence, the kind of silence that judges more harshly than words. Chuck released the wrist. Not a reward. Another test. The boy stumbled half a step back, blinking at the sudden freedom. He rubbed his arm, heat spreading where the hand had been. The cap still dangled from his other hand, brim crushed, patch visible to anyone who cared enough to read it. He should have stopped. Everyone could see it. Even his friend hesitated, camera drooping, eyes darting around to gauge reactions. But pride was louder than reason. The boy squared his shoulders again, jaw clenched, breath noisy. He stepped forward, this time more deliberate. The waitress's voice cut the air. "Don't." No longer a whisper. Her rag hung useless at her side, but the authority in her tone snapped heads toward her. The veteran slid his coffee cup out of harm's way, a slow, protective gesture, as if sheltering something fragile. The friend with the phone spread his stance, whooping for the crowd, trying to salvage control. It rang false. No one joined him. The boy drew his arm back, telegraphing the motion. Not subtle anymore, not theater. A swing fueled by frustration, not confidence. Chuck shifted his feet by the width of a shoe. Nothing more. But the entire room felt it. The way the geometry had changed. The space between restraint and confrontation had closed. The hiss of the coffee machine punctuated the silence. The boy's shoulder rolled forward. His elbow rose. The swing began. And in that instant, everyone in the diner learned the difference between a punch meant for show and a movement about to meet reality. The swing came clumsy and wide. Chuck didn't block it. He shifted a half step, let the boy's arm glance past his palm, and guided it away. A small pull at the wrist, a gentle turn at the elbow, and the punch evaporated. The boy stumbled forward, momentum betraying him, and collapsed against the edge of the booth with an awkward grunt. The room didn't cheer. It froze. The only sound was the hiss of the coffee machine. The second boy, still clutching his phone, tried to fill the silence. "Let's go!" he shouted, rushing in. His feet slapped the floor without rhythm. He grabbed for Chuck's shirt. Chuck pivoted, lifted the arm with effortless precision, and steered him down. The boy's knees buckled. He hit the floor with a loud smack of palm against tile. The impact drew a wince from the audience. The taller boy bounced up again, face flushed, pride pulling him forward. He lunged for a clumsy clinch. Chuck's forearm slid across his chest, halting him without force. A quick adjustment at the hip sent him back into the vinyl seat, harder this time. The sound of air leaving his chest echoed sharper than any insult. "Stop!" the waitress said firmly. No one mistook her words as directed at Chuck. The boy on the floor pushed up, yelling half a sentence he never finished. Chuck knelt beside him, a palm hovering just in front of his shoulder. No contact, only intent. The boy froze, confused by the sudden realization that space itself could be controlled. His friend's recording shook in his grip, the lens catching failure from every angle. The crowd leaned closer, phones lowered. They were watching something they hadn't expected. Violence undone without violence, a fight smothered by calm hands. A man at the counter nodded to himself. A teenager whispered, "Did you see that?" and forgot she was still filming. The taller boy tried one last time. He feinted left, dove right. Chuck's hand touched his forearm with 2 fingers, barely pressure at all, yet the boy's body pitched forward past balance. A subtle foot tap and gravity did the rest. He landed on one knee, both palms out, trapped by his own weight. Chuck stepped back, giving them room, voice even. Up. And stop. Neither boy moved at first. They stared, confused that the man hadn't shouted, hadn't swung, hadn't even raised his pulse. He simply ended their performance. The silence in the diner thickened, reverent. The veteran sat still, no longer clutching the counter. His hands were relaxed now, resting open on his lap. The tremor was still there, but it no longer defined him. Then Chuck bent down and picked up the cap. He didn't flourish it, didn't make a point of it. He shaped the brim with his thumb, as though remembering its curve, then placed it gently into the veteran's waiting hand. The old man closed his fingers around it, lifted it slowly, and set it back on his head. His back straightened, an inch, maybe less, but enough that everyone saw it. The gesture landed heavier than the takedowns. A symbol returned. The taller boy's bravado cracked. His voice wavered. "We were just—" He stopped. The sentence had nowhere to go. Chuck answered for him. "Now you're just done." The crowd held the silence. No one clapped. Applause would have cheapened it. Instead, people simply breathed together, a collective acknowledgement that they had witnessed something real, something stripped of show. The veteran touched the patch on the cap, smoothing the worn threads. He looked at Chuck, gratitude clear, but said nothing. He didn't need to. Chuck gave him a quiet nod. "It's finished." The boys stood awkwardly, their pride leaking out in silence. One tucked his phone into his jacket, suddenly ashamed of the red light still blinking. The other rubbed his wrist and stared at the floor. The diner began to stir again. Forks scraped plates. Cups met saucers. The coffee machine sighed back to life. But the atmosphere had changed. No one would forget what they'd just seen. At the doorway, a new customer stepped inside, eyes darting at the strange tableau. 2 boys standing still, an old man upright with his cap restored, and Chuck calm at the center. "Everything good here?" he asked casually. Every head turned, measuring whether good was the right word. The new arrival at the door froze, sensing something raw in the air. The taller boy was still bent at the knees, his chest rising fast, his friend shifting awkwardly beside him. For the first time that afternoon, their mouths had no material, no lines to play for the crowd. The taller one spoke first, voice low, broken. "We didn't know." He stared at the floor, then at Chuck. "We didn't know it was you." Chuck's eyes didn't flicker. His stance was loose again, like he'd already set the moment down. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about respect." The words cut sharper than any shove. He let them hang in the air. "You laughed at a man who's carried more than you'll ever understand. You thought that made you strong. But mocking someone who's given more than you can measure, that's weakness. That's all it is." The veteran lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but because the words carried too much weight to meet directly. His hands rested on the counter, cap steady on his head. The tremor was there, but it was background now, no longer the thing the room noticed first. The taller boy opened his mouth again, but his throat locked. The second one muttered, "We didn't mean," then stopped, hearing how hollow it sounded. He shoved his phone deeper into his jacket pocket, wishing the device could bury what it had already captured. Chuck didn't demand apology. He didn't humiliate them. He simply waited, his silence filling the space the way stone fills a foundation. The boys shifted, eyes down, learning without choosing to. At last, the veteran lifted his head. His spine seemed straighter now, shoulders more certain, as if the cap's return had added years back instead of taking them away. He looked at Chuck, and in his eyes there was gratitude, but also relief, like someone whose burden had been acknowledged without him asking. Chuck gave the smallest nod, nothing theatrical, and turned back toward his table. He picked up his cup, still warm, and sipped as if nothing had happened. His presence shrank again, folding neatly into the corner of the diner. For a beat, no one moved. Then a woman at the counter put her hands together once. The sound was tentative, fragile. A man followed, then another. The clapping grew, joined by a murmur, then a swell until it became something like applause, but not the kind you hear at games or shows. This was slower, weightier, carrying respect more than excitement. The boys stood in the middle of it, exposed. Their eyes stayed on the floor. No one jeered. No one shouted them out. The silence between claps carried its own judgment. The veteran stood, surprising himself. He rose carefully, one hand on the counter, then straightened fully. His posture was proud, upright, steady. The cap sat firmly where it belonged. For the first time since he'd walked in, his body didn't look small. The applause crested, then faded on its own, leaving the room filled not with noise, but with quiet acknowledgement. Forks touched plates again, cups refilled. A hum returned, but softer now, respectful. Chuck set his cup down gently. He didn't smile, didn't grandstand. He just let the moment settle. The boys shuffled back to their booth, smaller than when they'd walked in. The veteran adjusted the brim of his cap, breathed deeply, and allowed himself a faint, private smile. He didn't look at the boys. He didn't need to. The lesson wasn't for him. In the window's reflection, the scene fixed itself. The old soldier standing tall, two youths humbled by their own noise, and a man in the corner booth sipping coffee, as if the world outside had never paused at all. That was the final image, the kind of moment that no phone could fully capture, because the power of it wasn't in the spectacle, but in the silence that followed.